This morning, I want to talk to you about the topic of engagement. Engagement. This is one of the things that I hear most from leaders and teams, things they're interested in, is how do we get people more engaged? How do we get them to be committed, more accountable, and pulling in the same direction? It makes sense, right? Because that's the sort of central task of a leader in any situation. There's a lot of information out there about this too, but I've got to admit, I've got kind of a gripe about the information that's out there, because when you read it, it looks like it's describing something that sort of looks like this. It's a situation where we're trying to get people to work together. We're imagining this sort of great partnership that we have where everybody's sort of working together in unison. That's the goal, right? That we're all kind of moving in the same direction with the same energy and all. There's nothing wrong with that picture. It's just that it's so static, right? You can see where you're going. Everything's placid. The goal is clear. And I don't know about you, but this isn't really descriptive of my usual experience as a leader of teams. In fact, mine probably looks a little more like this, maybe. You had that experience too, right? It's not placid. Everything is in motion. There are times that people kind of lose their grip, as you see here, and desperately your job is to get everybody back on task and pulling in the same direction so that you can move in the direction that you want to go. That's your challenge as a leader, right? To keep everybody fully engaged in the task. And that's just plain hard to do. That's because in our culture today, the sort of standard operating procedure is disengagement. This won't be a surprise to any of you, but Gallup was doing a study on this to put some figures to it. They do a study every number of years to kind of assess the current state of engagement. And you'll see here that in the U.S., only about 32% of employees are engaged. Only about 32. In the world, only about 13% are engaged. Let me clarify what they mean by engaged, okay? Being fully engaged is like that idea of the boat that you just saw there. It's everybody's digging in. They're all pulling in the same direction. They're really getting that paddle in the water, and we're moving forward, right? The next category is the disengaged. Now, that's not quite the same posture. It's more like when I was on a canoe trip once with my son. I'm paddling down the river, and I'm feeling like, boy, this is really hard to be doing. I'm surprised that I can't make any better progress. And I turn around, and I see that Zachary's sitting in the back, and he's putting his paddle in the water and letting it just sort of float by, and then taking it out of the water again and setting it back in the water and letting it sort of float by. He's not really getting the traction that we're looking for. And that would be sort of a metaphor for what it means to be disengaged. But then we also have the category of the actively disengaged. Now, if the engaged are those that are really digging in, paddling in the same direction all in unison, and the disengaged are those that are just not really getting quite the same traction, then the actively disengaged, well, they're busy drilling holes in the bottom of the boat. Right? They're not just not helping you progress in the direction you go. They're actively slowing your roll, keeping you from moving forward and being productive. And all of this is busy in our organizations and our teams. And if the statistics are right, more people are disengaged than are engaged. And so what I want to talk to you about today is, how do you go about changing that? How do you get people engaged? How do you get them to care about this, to take more ownership, to be more committed to the task at hand? And I want to introduce you to a specific model of this called the 5 Foundations of Accountability. I want to give you some practical tools to take with you, not just so that you understand engagement and commitment a little bit better, but so that you can lead differently tomorrow. This will give you some ways to think about it, some hooks to hang your ideas on regarding engagement and cultivating commitment. Now, one thing that I've learned is that when I talk about accountability, I need to take a couple minutes to kind of unpack and recalibrate what we mean by accountability. It's one of the most popular topics, or at least the most common topics that I hear in working with leaders and teams, because every leader is looking to make their team members more accountable. But as we drill into that, I find that people have different ideas of accountability, and they're not always the right ideas. Many people think of accountability as sort of this sort of moment of reckoning, right? This sort of difficult conversation that you have to have with somebody that you lead. And while that might be somewhat involved with accountability, if that's all you think of accountability, well, then you're a day late and a dollar short. That's never going to move people to greater ownership and greater commitment, at least not in the long run. And so I want to get that notion of this moment of reckoning out of our system and give us some other ways to think of accountability before we dive into these 5 foundations. Let's talk about the difference that accountability makes in a team. First of all, accountability makes the difference between owners and hired hands. Owners and hired hands. You might recognize the language that I'm actually using there. It should be familiar to you. Jesus uses this language in John 10, where he's debating with the Pharisees, and he's talking about kind of the different levels of ownership and commitment, and he starts contrasting the idea of an owner with that of a hired hand in terms of being a shepherd and watching over the sheep. Because he says, a hired hand, there's a way that you can tell if somebody is the hired hand, and that is that when things get tough and when the heat is on, the hired hand bails and runs away. He was a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. And he flees because he is a hired hand and he cares nothing for the sheep. You get that posture, that idea of a hired hand. When you don't own this personally, you have a little more opportunity to walk away. You don't take it quite so seriously. And when things get tough, sometimes the hired hand gets going. Right? Now, on the other hand, let's contrast this with a different story in the Bible. This is another story about a shepherd, so I think it's a great contrast here, but this is no hired hand. This is the story of David. Okay, now this isn't great King David that we're used to. This is young David when he's still just a boy. He's fresh from the fields. This is in 1 Samuel 17, and you remember this story. I think it's when Goliath has been taunting the Israelites and their armies, and somebody has to step up and deal with this. And David volunteers. This little scrawny shepherd boy volunteers to go fight Goliath. And if you'll remember, there's a point at which King Saul wants to give David his armor, and David says, it's just too heavy, I can't handle this, and he sets it aside, and he says, but I'm going to take him on like this. I'm going to go get him. And Saul tries to give him good counsel, right? He says, you can't do that. He says, you're just a shepherd boy, And Goliath, he is a walking war machine. He's been fighting since his youth, and there is no way that you can take him on. Now, David responds. And I love this response, okay? Contrast this with the words we just heard about what mentality a hired hand has. This is what David says to Saul. He says, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and I struck him, and I delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. That sounds a little different than the hired hand, right? I mean, listen to the kind of commitment David has there. He didn't say, when the wolf comes or the lion comes, I ran away. In fact, no, I went after him. And then I took the sheep back, and then even after that, I grabbed him by his beard and slew him. That's commitment, right? That kind of initiative is the sign of someone who really owns the task, owns the mission. And it demonstrates a high level of accountability. So when we use the term accountability, one of the things we're drawing a distinction between is whether you have the mindset of a hired hand or whether you have the kind of mindset of an owner. Another difference that accountability makes is it makes the difference between momentum and inertia. It's not just the difference between owners and hired hands, it's the difference between momentum and inertia. Now, I'm borrowing these terms, of course, from physics, but I think it's going to be a good image for you to hold on to. I think you can relate to this because some of the people that you lead have inertia and some have momentum. Let me explain. If some of them have inertia, they're like this chair. You know, when you ask them to move, you can provide a little encouragement, a little motivation, and they move, right? But the moment that you stop applying that, what happens? They stop, right? How quickly do they stop? The moment that you take your hand off of them, right? This is what I mean by inertia. You can try to move somebody, but they stop immediately after you do that. That's what we mean by inertia. Now, let's contrast that instead with some folks that are on your team, some people that you work with have momentum, right? Now, when you provide motivation and direction for them, they move too, but look at the difference. They keep moving, right? After you've given them some direction, I mean, you may have to come back and kind of nudge them or get the direction correct and kind of do some correcting, but they have a life of their own, an initiative of their own, because they have momentum, right? So think about your team, the people that you work with now for just a moment. You know, some of them have inertia and some of them have momentum, right? I know some of you are thinking about this because I see some of you have already written names in the margins of your paper there, right? Which would you rather have? Rather have momentum, right? Because look, if all the people that you work with have inertia, this is a tough job for us as leaders, right? We always have to be there to provide the direction and the motivation. And the moment we have to turn our attention elsewhere, which, well, let's face it, is most of the moments, all action stops. And if we want to have momentum, what we're really talking about is a higher level of commitment, greater accountability in our people. And the question that most leaders are asking themselves is, well, how do I raise that level of accountability? How do I get more people to have a life of their own and the momentum that serves our purpose best? So as we're recalibrating the notions of accountability here, it's the difference between owners and hired hands. It's the difference between momentum and the difference between that and inertia. And it's also the difference between commitment and involvement. Commitment and involvement. Now, I grew up in the country, and we have a sort of homespun saying to help clarify the difference between commitment and involvement. You may have heard it, right? The difference is ham and eggs. Have you heard this? Because in ham and eggs, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. Think about it. I'll let that sink in just a minute. Pardon the bad pun, but that's because the pig has real skin in the game, right? All right, they're really involved, all right? That's what we're looking for, is how do we get that kind of commitment? Now, I think most of us appreciate that there are different postures towards the mission and the vision that we are trying to lead people towards, and it's easy for us to think that there are two choices. People are either for it or they're against it. But it's actually a little more complicated than this, and if we think about it that way, it helps us foster greater accountability, because it's not simply for and against. There are actually multiple levels of commitment to the vision. This is from Peter Senge. You have a handout in your notes there if you want to kind of check out some closer definitions about it. But take a look at this hierarchy here. We could start down near the bottom. This is where we don't see much commitment, obviously, when people are apathetic. In fact, in this case, they have no feelings about the vision at all. They're neither for it nor against it. They just don't care about it at all. In fact, that may be the most dangerous sort of place on this list. If you have anyone that's apathetic, it's unlikely that they're going to pull in the right direction or dig in with the rest of you, because they simply don't care. But let's move up the list a little bit here. You could have people that are non-compliant. This is somebody that they don't buy into this. They're not for the mission. They're not for the vision. And they're going to tell everybody about it. They're going to say, I'm just not on board. Okay? Those are the people that are actively disengaged that we talked about earlier. You can move up a little farther here, and you could see people that are grudgingly compliant. You probably know some of these people now. These are folks that they don't really buy into this vision either. They're not deeply committed. They don't own it in the way that you'd like them to, but they're going to do just enough not to lose their job, not to lose their position, not to have negative consequences happen to them. That's that grudging compliance level. We can move above that even to formal and genuine compliance. In this case, people get it. I mean, they buy into this enough that they think that the vision is a good thing, the mission is a good thing, and they're going to do what's expected of them, exactly what you've asked for. Now, it's interesting to me because often when we hit this level on this list, this genuine compliance where people are doing exactly what's asked of them, exactly what's expected of them, it sounds pretty good to a lot of leaders. And what I find is that many leaders think that compliance is as good as it gets. If I can ask people to do something and they do it, if this is something that we're relying on them to do in their position or their role and they do it, then that's great. But look, we're still below that line. There's still a couple levels above this. Compliance isn't as good as it gets because when we go above this line, we start seeing things like enrollment and commitment, and the locus of control changes here, and somebody decides that they own this mission. Now it's not the leader's goal or the organization's vision, it's their own. And you can see that demonstrated because they suddenly use a lot more energy to pursue it. When we get to enrollment and commitment, well, not only are they going to do what's expected of them, they're going to do whatever it takes to accomplish this. If they're in the enrollment stage, they're going to do whatever it takes within the current structures and expectations and opportunities. And if we get them all the way up to the commitment level, then they're going to even invent new structures and new ways of doing this and whatever it takes to get the job done because they are deeply committed and they own the mission personally. You get a feel for that hierarchy? So when we talk about that hierarchy, what we're really talking about here is sort of a level of accountability. And our job as leaders, in whatever context you find yourselves, is to elevate people's accountability, to move them up this list. Now, take a moment here and kind of audit the people that you work with, the team that you work with. Are they owners or are they hired hands? Are they committed or involved? Do they have inertia or do they have momentum? Because your job is to move them higher on that scale, to cause them to evidence higher levels of accountability and be more committed. Now, I will tell you this, though. As you look at this list, it's easy to think of people on your team and kind of realize that your team isn't all equal, right? You have different people at different levels in this, and you may want to commit yourself to moving them up that. But take note of this. You can never move somebody higher on this list than you are yourself. So when we think about elevating somebody's level of commitment and raising the accountability of your teams, the first thing you have to think about is how committed am I? Where am I on this list? Sometimes that's one of the hardest jobs I have. I get a call from a leader or a team and they say, come help us build accountability in our team. I want to get these people to really own this sort of thing. And as I come and visit with them, I find out that maybe the hardest and first message that I need to deliver is, well, how committed are you? Because you can't call someone higher on this list than you are, right? In the end, that's because accountability isn't what we kind of colloquially think of it. It's not this moment of reckoning, this opportunity to call somebody to be accountable for something. It's actually a decision that someone has to make for themselves. They have to choose to take ownership of a situation. And then they demonstrate that accountability by owning the outcomes and being responsible for what happens before and after the fact. That's how we see accountability, but ultimately, accountability involves a choice. It's an act of somebody's volition, and so for that reason, you can't slap some accountability on somebody. They have to make the choice for themselves, and as a leader, you want to do everything that you can to encourage and equip them to make that choice, to step up and say, I'm all in. I'm going to be committed to this. And so that's where we're going today. Today we're going to talk about those 5 different foundations of accountability. What this is these are the things that you can do as a leader. As a leader, you cannot command accountability. You have to cultivate the kind of experience and the kind of context that makes people decide for themselves, hey, I'm going to step it up. I'm going to buy in more. I'm going to elevate my commitment level and my accountability. And that means that you need to attend to 5 specific foundations. If you attend these in your leadership, you're going to find that people naturally choose to own the endeavor more. You're going to see their commitment level rise. And for that matter, if you find that commitment is lacking in your team, the first thing that you'll want to do is audit these 5 foundations because it's likely that one or more of them is lacking or anemic. In fact, some of you today, as you hear this, you're thinking about it in terms of being a leader and fostering a greater level of commitment in your people. But you're also going to be thinking about this, I'm sure, in terms of your own commitment level, your own accountability, and how much you own what you're charged to pursue. You may find that some of these things are lacking in your own experience as well.